All right. So, I'm not sure if it would be possible for us to find a heavier, harder, or more challenging gospel lesson for New Member Sunday. All right, I looked at this and I was like, you got to be kidding me. Jesus called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and the sake of the gospel will save it. Death, suffering, crucifixion. Jesus, you're really selling this whole discipleship, church membership thing, all right? Up until this point in Mark's gospel, Jesus' ministry has been about teaching about God's love. It's about giving people forgiveness for sins, healing people, and miraculously feeding huge crowds. Pretty popular stuff, right? Yeah, I'll be a part of that. Until now. Now Jesus starts to reveal quite openly what it means to be the Messiah, the Christ, and what it looks like to be his follower. There have been debates and discussions by scholars about how Peter goes from being the first, if you go right before this, Peter says, you're the Messiah, and Jesus says, great job, to being called Satan, the opponent, the adversary, the tempter. Is it that Peter is simply trying to protect his friend and teacher? Is it that Peter misunderstands Jesus' words and teachings? Or is it because Peter understands all too well and doesn't like what he's hearing? Peter has just named Jesus the Messiah, the Christ, God's anointed. Does anybody remember what popular opinion, what people thought the Messiah was going to do? Anybody remember? Push out the Romans, right? Restore Israel to greatness, bring back the good old days. It was understood that the Messiah would be a mighty warrior king like David from the Old Testament. The Messiah would free Israel from the control, violence, and oppression of the Romans. The Messiah would wield violence against the wicked and the evil for the sake of the good. Messiahs weren't supposed to die. In fact, that was the very test that confirmed that they indeed were not the Messiah. Oh, you're dead? Okay, not the Messiah. Messiahs were supposed to win. And so I go back to our gospel lesson for this morning. More so than any other of Jesus' teaching, this call to nonviolence has challenged Christians and the church for 2,000 years. James and John, another two of the disciples, want to call down fire from heaven on a town that has rejected Jesus later. And Jesus is like, slow down, guys. Peter, on the night of Jesus' betrayal, Peter again, he draws a sword and cuts off one of the slaves' ears who comes to arrest Jesus. Down the road, the Christian church comes up with the whole concept of just war to determine which wars Christians can participate in with a clear conscience. How violent can we be, God? When are we allowed to be violent? When are we allowed to fight back? And Jesus' answer is just as controversial now as it was then. Because I think we can all agree that there are many things in our lives that are worth living for, right? I think we could probably name a whole book. And there's even things in our lives that we would consider dying for, right? We would be hard-pressed to find in the Bible anything that Jesus says is worth killing for. And I don't know about any of you, but I want to rebuke Jesus, right? I want to tell him that he's naive, that he's silly. Yeah, Jesus, what about ISIS? How's that going to work out? Yeah, Jesus, what about that guy in Florida? How would have that worked out? It just isn't practical, God. Nonviolence won't work. You don't know what you're talking about, Jesus. You are going to get us all killed. And I shudder to think about how Jesus would reply to me after I try to set him straight. This insistence on nonviolence, even to the point of death, is part of the eternal scandal and challenge of the cross. Through his suffering and death on the cross, Jesus conquers. Not through violence, but by suffering others' violence. And I don't know about you, but this sounds crazy to me. This sounds naive to me. This sounds impossible. Until we see it with our own two eyes. Gandhi, on a hunger strike to expose the British Empire. Civil rights protesters being beaten, sprayed with fire hoses and bitten by dogs to reveal injustice at the heart of America in the 1960s. Nuns and priests being gunned down in El Salvador to show their government's oppression and violence. In looking at these witnesses, these martyrs, I feel closer to Peter and the rest of the disciples who flee, who deny, and who betray their Lord and Savior. I feel closer to those who deny, dodge, and avoid the cross at all costs. And yet I thank God for God's grace. What happens after Peter rebukes Jesus' difficult teaching of nonviolence? Does Jesus get rid of Peter, vote him off the island, or demote him? No, where does he send him? He says something very interesting. You're always allowed to cheat. Where does he put him?
Gates of Hades.
Good guess. He says something very specific. He says, "Get behind me, Satan." The interesting thing, though, is that behind a teacher is the traditional place of a disciple, so that they can continue to watch, to learn, to grow. And after the crucifixion on Easter Sunday, who does Jesus want to see and work with right away? He wants to see his disciples, the ones who just messed it up, the ones who just abandoned him. There is nothing that you can do or say that will ever make God give up on you. There is no action you can take to put your life beyond the redemptive, nonviolent call of the cross. I'll be honest with y'all. And if Erica was here, she could confirm this for certain. I don't have all the answers. Or even most of the answers. And I certainly don't know how exactly to apply Jesus' active, nonviolent resistance against the forces of evil and oppression. And my fervent prayer every day is that none of us ever have to face someone trying to hurt us or someone we love. What I do know is that like any skill or muscle, we must practice and develop God's self-giving love through daily successes and failures. Again, I pray that you never face a life or death situation, and yet I know that that's not my regular day-to-day existence. I do know that I regularly do battle with violent thoughts or violent words. Anybody have those temptations when they're driving? Online? Perhaps this is a chance for us to flex our nonviolent cross-shaped muscles. Our boss yells at us or demeans us. How will we respond without taking the abuse or resorting to similar violence? Someone disagrees with you online and puts you down. How will you respond? Will you come up with a superior comeback or simply offer a blessing of peace? You witness bullying at school. How will you respond to ensure the target gets help and support without sinking to the level of violence? I'll never forget, and I think I've shared this story with you all before, but I'm going to share it again. Because I think nonviolence takes creativity and it takes thinking outside of our normal framework. There's this crazy church that travels around the country that protests soldiers' funerals, and they do all sorts of damage in the name of the Lord. I can't remember their name right now, and I don't really care to. But they were traveling to, some of you might remember Matthew Shepard. He was a young man who was gay who was murdered in Wyoming. And this church showed up at his funeral to celebrate his death. So they're outside of the church, where his parents are going to walk down and see. I don't know about you, but I'd be pretty sorely tempted to hit one of those people. Or do something else that... What some of Matthew's friends came up with, though, and I thought this was beautiful, is they dressed up like angels. And they got these giant wings. And so when the family came out, instead of seeing the protesters, there was a wall of angels. Nonviolence will be hard. Nonviolence will take creativity. Nonviolence will require messing up, getting back in line, fixing our eyes on Christ, and trying again and again. Go in peace to live into the cross-shaped love of our crucified Lord and Savior.